So this year, the most difficult question to answer has been, how are you? We often simply connect with fine, how are you? But reality for many of us has felt far from fine, and connections far from simple. What underlies this casual interaction is the fact that many usual relationships have become fraught and heavy. Not only the world post-October 7th, but largely because what has emerged is the feeling of a new wave of permeating fear and anti-Semitism. The violence and trauma of this last year exposed a layer of local and national anti-Semitism whose embedded ferocity in our culture surfaced at a time when our nerves as a people were exposed and our capacities to respond were and are limited. How are you? Pause. It mentally unfolds rapidly. Who is asking? How well do they know me? What do they know about the world? Where do I or they stand? What is safe to say? What will I step on or in? And what is my capacity to respond? What do we share? Where do we differ? What is at stake? This exhausting internal monologue often ends in a few places. Well, given the state of the world, but all things considered, fine, and you? What I have found from conversations with so many of you is that underneath this familiar monologue of grief and brokenness is a deep loneliness. This loneliness has made this year intensely painful and griefful. Even aside from the devastating violence across the world in Israel and Gaza, or on college campuses, in legislations against trans and queer people in places like Florida and Texas, along the US border, and now increasingly invited in places like Springfield, Ohio. This loneliness feels different than pandemic loneliness, which at least felt like in some moments, many of us were experiencing the same thing. No, living as Jews, whether it was in the secular world or in some Jewish spaces, has been an increasingly isolating place to be. And if we carry multiple identities, liberal, Black, brown, LGBTQ, poor, woman, immigrant, disabled, to name a few, alongside our Jewish identity, this loneliness is even more pronounced. Anti-Semitism, so directly linked with white nationalism, was publicly palpable after the 2016 election, after the attacks in Charlottesville and in Pittsburgh, and so many other places. But the isolation of now comes from feeling unsure where we stand. It's clear we stand against white Christian nationalism and supremacy, yet many of the places where we had stood as allies for civil rights in struggle and solidarity, for whose justice we have done intense communal work, now seemed incapable of viewing our Jewish communities as also experiencing oppression. This was true particularly as some anti-racism and other anti-oppression movements took strong stances against Israel and sometimes, intentionally or not, against Jews. This is exactly the goal and the point of anti-Semitism: isolation and division. So what do we do? Anti-Semitism from the white nationalistic right is a public act of oppression that seeks supremacy and control. It is the same force that creates racism, misogyny, transphobia, homophobia, xenophobia, and ableism. It is rooted in power and tyranny. However, because anti-Semitism functions differently than other forms of oppression, and because many Jews have enjoyed white privilege in the United States over the past decades, it's often made invisible and therefore susceptible to the progressive left as well. Most supremacy thrives on the oppression of the people they are seeking to control and the suppression of their voice and power. But anti-Semitism functions differently. For anti-Semitism to thrive, it relies on Jews being in positions of power and influence, and then pointing to something unnatural or manipulative or controlling. Hence, because it does not appear that Jews are oppressed, think tropes of money or power or land or control, it becomes easier for other allied and oppressed minority groups to see Jews as the class of oppressors, rather than in solidarity with victims of hatred. It is systemic, both fueling and fueled by other forms of hate and extremism. And it becomes too easy to scapegoat our people for having privilege and control on the left and use this false narrative to manipulate that our power is the reason why other suppressed classes have succeeded from the right. We know both are wholly untrue. All are rooted in manipulated stereotypes for the political and power gain of white supremacy, and all lead to violence, disempowerment, and hatred. Eric Ward of Race Forward, the Western State Center, and the Southern Poverty Law Center teaches about the intersection between racism and anti-Semitism and how both equally animate white nationalism. Ward, who is Black and Christian, writes, "Anti-Semitism is an equal opportunity ideology. Like the novel Coronavirus, this virulent ideology disproportionately impacts the most vulnerable, the Jewish population, but in fact imperils us all. Because it doesn't look like anti-Black racism, we may think it's not a big deal, but I think it's the biggest deal," he says. "Anti-Semitism is an effective conspiracy theory that dehumanizes all of us. It distorts our understanding of how the actual world works. It isolates us. It alienates us from our communities, from our neighbors, and from participating in governance. Anti-Semitism isn't just bigotry toward the Jewish community. It more accurately utilizes bigotry toward the Jewish community and those seen as proximate to it to deconstruct democratic practices, and it does so by framing democracy as a conspiracy rather than a tool of empowerment or as a functional tool of governance." Ward continues, "The fight against anti-Semitism must be values-based, or it is nothing. With social and economic justice movements committed to equality, we have not yet collectively come to terms with the centrality of anti-Semitism to white nationalist ideology and the authoritarian moment the United States finds itself in. It is desperately time for us to have that conversation." Because anti-Semitism alienates us from our communities and our neighbors, this is where we have to start. Ward continues, "I'm not here to create hierarchies of oppression around anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism. What I'm here to say is that they're killing us both. We don't need more politics. We need more stories that thread us together." So I'll just pause to say that was a lot. And all of this, we do print all of this on our website so you can go through and read and digest, because it's a lot just to hear and take in. These stories, to thread us together, are most powerful when they are rooted in real relationships. And these relationships, particularly on the left, in non-Jewish places, is where change is possible and proximal. Neighbors, friends, school superintendents and boards, administrators, teachers, city council and alderpeople and coworkers. We start where we are and let our Jewish values guide us in speaking up and speaking out. For if we do not invest in those relationships and we do not keep showing up for all the justice issues we care so deeply about, then we will continue to feel isolated. This is hard. But this is where we are. I jokingly said to Superintendent Marcus Campbell of ETHS when he reached out to me on Monday to say, I'm writing something to our community about October 7th and this moment, and I could really use your eyes on this. This was this past Monday. And I said, Marcus, I love and respect you, but you're a pastor's kid, and you know this is a little bit like asking your pastor to do all of this work for you on December 23rd. And then said, that's the insipid anti-Semitism at play, because you didn't say, I know it's 2 days before Rosh Hashanah and you're about to lead your community in the biggest, hardest day of the year. And he said, I'm really sorry, I missed that. Relationships. And then I sent him a meme of a coffee mug that says, be careful or you'll end up in my sermon. That's a favorite. To which he said, fair enough. So Marcus, there you go. Later, I'll tell you a story about a really good city worker that recognized who I was and said, oh my God, it's the day of Rosh Hashanah. We're not doing this now. Have a great new year. Thank you, Mark McIntyre. So last year, on October 8th, Interfaith Action of Evanston celebrated its annual Vision Keeper Dinner, where each year we celebrate the justice work in each of our congregations and raise funds for our most vulnerable unhoused neighbors. And it is usually an evening of solidarity. And it was anything but. It was October 8th, and the confluence of some administrative oversights led to JRC's honorees being skipped in the recognitions. There was no Jewish voice scheduled to speak in the program, and the closing benediction was given by a Christian pastor who gave a vivid Christ-centered prayer. But the most painful and violating element was an act of omission. It was October 8th, and no one said anything about what was happening in Israel, and more directly, no one spoke to the Jews in the room. It was stunning. I sat with 2 tables of JRC members, frozen at the end of the event. Surely, in the best of circumstances, a recognition that attacks on Jews, of terrorism, of fear in a shared Holy Land would warrant a blessing or an acknowledgement. But there was nothing. And surprisingly, no upstanders from our active interfaith cohort. I waited a day or so, and nothing. I had one text from a pastor, but mostly as the memes and posts began to appear, none were voicing support for Jews from outside the Jewish community. Many voiced support for liberation of Palestinians, against the actions of the Israeli government, responses to bombings, but as the world began to divide between posting blue and white or red, black, and green, the silence in between was incredulous. The grief in our Jewish world this year has been loud and obvious and complex. And what I have come to learn is that my interfaith colleagues both care very, very deeply, and also they really didn't know or understand, and so they were absent because of it. They were so torn. How to condemn all of the killing and bombing without sounding anti-Israel, but also naming innocent victims? Where's the voice of justice? This is exactly the trap that anti-Semitism creates, a world in which one is either the oppressor or the victim, and the one with the most pain wins. It's the same metaphor as with racism. Racism isn't a shark in the ocean, it's the water itself. And our nation is drowning in anti-Semitism. On October 11th, hours before our JRC vigil, I sent the most direct message of tochacha, of rebuke, that I have ever written in my life to our interfaith clergy group. Its essence was the same question that God asks of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Ayeka, where are you? Is it not possible to feel horrified and speak out for justice for people across the world, but also see that your neighbors in front of you are bleeding? Where are you? Many clergy showed up that night to our JRC vigil, and then everyone showed up to our monthly clergy lunch the next day, in which myself and Rabbi Andrea London talked and cried for 2 hours, and they witnessed us. We were raw together, and we called our colleagues in. We have shown up for you. What about us? This story ends very well. And what followed was not simple and did not fix or change overnight. Just as we read in Torah today, perhaps it started with the voice of God who saw Hagar wandering with Ishmael alone in the wilderness after being cast out in fear by Sarah, and intervenes to find the well of water. And perhaps, like the unseen angel who stays the knife in Abraham's hand that we will read tomorrow, sometimes the voice that interrupts the harm has to be our own. Our multi-faith, multi-racial, multi-generational, multi-ethnic, multi-economic clergy group prides itself in being a moral and courageous voice in the Evanston community, and sometimes we fail. And when that happens, we do tshuva, repentance and repair. We have done it for racism and reparations, for homelessness, for sanctuary, and now we are doing it for antisemitism. The process of tshuva is specific. 1, publicly own the harm perpetrated. 2, do the work to become the kind of person who doesn't do harm, which requires so much inner work. 3, make restitution for harm done in whatever way possible. Then 4, apologize for the harm caused in whatever way that it will make it as right as possible for the victim. And 5, when faced with the opportunity to cause similar harm in the future, make a better choice. Over the past year, the Evanston Interfaith Clergy and Leaders Group has done tshuva so well. There were apologies in public. The voices changed. The voices did not remove support for Palestinians, nor should they have, or shift to blanket support of all things in the Israeli government, nor should they have. But tshuva fundamentally changed the way we examined invitations to each of our congregations to speak, to rally, to sign petitions, and to support resolutions. In a community activated by anti-oppression social justice values, we paused and looked at the bigger picture together. This pause was the work. This is not to say that my colleagues don't have the right to have different political opinions than I do. Of course they do. Our congregations might make different choices about endorsements or speaking out. Of course we do. But this process of calling in and raising up the insipid ways in which anti-Semitism has divided us and poisoned our water allowed us all to recognize these harmful tropes and take one another's humanity into account first. It invited my colleagues to say, my community is thinking about this, but then how will this affect you? Am I missing something? In February, the clergy group brought 2 historians to present a side-by-side history of Israel-Palestine, one professor of Jewish history and the other senior scholar of the Arab Gulf States Institute. They lecture together regularly on shared Jewish, Palestinian, Israeli, and Arab history and divergent paths, nuance, and possibility. In preparation to lead hundreds in conversation following these talks, our Interfaith Clergy Group went through the facilitated exercise ourselves. In a 2-minute reflection exercise, I was paired with a white male Christian pastor. The question, what changed for you because of listening to your partner's experience? Was the prompt. Well, he said, when the war began, I asked myself where Jesus would be standing because that's how I use my faith as part of my moral compass. And I could see so clearly that Jesus was standing under the rubble in Gaza, crying out with innocent Palestinians who were running for their lives. Where else could Jesus be? And then he paused and took a breath and said, but Jesus is sitting with you too. And because I know you, and you showed your pain, and we are in relationship together, I see now that you are broken. So I know that's where I have to be, in both places. I missed that before, because if Jesus can be in both places, so can I. Jesus has never felt so comforting to me before. He's right behind the tapestry right there. And Pastor Grace, we found a little Jesus sitting here with the clergy piece. And so I put him on the bima with us, because that way you're right here with me too. He's very cute. The next exercise, we changed partners with the prompt, what response rose in your community following the attacks in Israel and Gaza? I felt my own defenses rising as I wondered what people would say. Another colleague, a Black woman pastor in one of our local Black churches, spoke, where many congregants had been vocal at city council hearings and on anti-racism Facebook pages that were laden with anti-Semitic tropes. She said, when I think about what happened on October 7th, I think about the women, the Jewish women, and the women taken hostage, and the unspeakable violence committed against them, and how it made me think of how many Black women in my own community live with such violence all the time, and it goes unrecognized and delegitimized because they are Black. And I felt tremendous empathy. I exhaled, and then I felt really ashamed. In making assumptions because of larger communal voices and because of stereotypes, I had steadied myself for opposition and not human engagement. My own internalized racism did exactly what Eric Ward is warning against, dividing communities of relationship and allyship against one another. And so this time, the tshuva was mine to do. We continue to work together. If I never see another Google Doc edited by 18 different clergy voices, it might be too soon, but bring it on. You might notice we've gotten very good at writing statements together. They take hours and hours. This might sound familiar, like our JRC community did as the Israel-Palestine Working Group led us in making a statement back in November. Perhaps not the one we individually would write, but one we all could sign. We have resisted the request to sign outside letters in favor of the painstaking process of writing our own. We wordsmith, and then we ask what's under each word. When one pastor says, but I can't sign it if it says this, another gets on the phone and we check the assumption, and oftentimes it's one or two words that makes the difference. And gradually over this year, it has stopped being the work of the Jewish clergy to initiate and started being the group as a whole. This past Sunday evening, 18 pastors, reverends, rabbis, ministers, and interfaith leaders stood together at this year's Vision Keeper dinner and did public tshuva for last year. As Maimonides taught, the group publicly owned the harm perpetrated. We described the interpersonal and group work we did to minimize harm in the future. We talked about the restitution we made in public and in private. We apologized for the harm caused, and those injured accepted the apology. And lastly, we shared that when we were faced with opportunities to cause similar harm again, we made different choices. This is hard, but this is what the spiritual work of these high holidays call upon us to do. And I am so grateful that right now, so many of my interfaith colleagues, Christian, Lutheran, Episcopalian, United Church of Christ, Baha'i, Methodist, and Presbyterian, have joined us here today in this sanctuary right now to celebrate Rosh Hashanah with us. I am grateful for your presence today. I am grateful you are my colleagues, and I'm grateful you are my friends. And we don't do just hard things together, like protests and letters and facilitation and tshuva. We also have lunch together and scheme about how we might make affordable housing in Evanston and keep funding reparations, and we go out for drinks and we eat waffles and we hold each other's babies and we show up when one another is honored. I, and therefore our JRC community, is very lucky. Now, I am aware that most people don't have on hand such a diverse group ready to learn with open hearts and clarity of faith, honed to receive rebuke with grace, with a broad reach, ability to get our opinions published or read on the US House floor like we did this year. It's true. That is a bit of a clergy luxury. But many of us do have people in our circles who are different than we are. Many of us have people in our lives who are not intimately familiar with Jewish traditions or how we live our Jewish lives that we could welcome in. And so we have to remember that one of the best ways to combat anti-Semitism is to be more Jewish, and to do it out loud. Who might you invite to a Shabbat service? Perhaps to light Shabbat candles or Hanukkah candles, or just eat latkes with you. Maybe you'll bring food to the office in honor of a holiday. Offer to read a book in your child or grandchild's classroom with a Jewish theme. Maybe you'll mention or talk about going to a Jewish event, or educate the teachers in your child's school a bit further about why bring in something from your country of origin isn't as simple for Jews as the modern country. Tell your neighbors when you see an anti-Semitic sign of vandalism that it's not just another sign of violence, but that as a Jew it feels scary and you need their support. Wear the Jewish jewelry and tell the story of how you came to wear it. Pair the conversation with the symbol because the conversation makes all the difference. This year, perhaps your answer to, "How are you?" might simply be, "It feels hard to be Jewish right now." Can I tell you why? It's a risk. But if we don't speak up and connect with our Jewish selves, the insipid anti-Semitism within our culture will continue to water the roots of supremacy. It might also provide, as it did for me many times this year, surprising moments of support and connection, and challenge the assumptions we also make from afar. For this is the moment to move away from isolation and into a period of connection and generativity. This is the moment to ask ourselves, how might we invest in our relationships, particularly with those who are different rather than retreating? How might we make intentional choices to share our Jewish experiences and show up with them in public and not compromise our shared social justice values? To be more Jewish. While our response to increased anti-Semitism could be to build more barriers around Jewish spaces and separate ourselves from the other, I believe that the safer, more lasting, and more effective response to anti-Semitism will come when we build spaces in which we bring our whole selves, the parts of ourselves that are Jewish, and everything else, and keep reaching across the difference and diversities. We have to do it, and sometimes the feeling that this work is upon us is frustrating and unfortunate. But we cannot wait. When we bring our own chairs to the table of equity and diversity, we bring the conversation about anti-Semitism along with our solidarity to build a stronger democracy, and we will be more successful in dismantling anti-Semitism for good. It will take us showing up as Jews in spaces that aren't Jewish, and bringing our education, and bringing our open and broken hearts. This year, may the inscription in the book of life be loud. May our Jewish identities keep coming out in all of our communities, animating us amid the pain and the loss to keep connecting. The response to Ayeka, to where are you? We all know what it is. It's Hineni. Here we are. To be more Jewish, not inside in this room, but just like we did outside at the lakefront last night, in public spaces, to say, here we are, and we are proud. May we all bring all of our Jewish selves to our relationships, and may all of our relationships grow and flourish in the name of empathy, of wholeness, and of justice. Amen.
Amen.
So here we are to awaken ourselves to the shofar. That was long, I know. Honestly, I couldn't figure out how to cut it down.